The fog rolled thick across the winding country road as I drove toward my hometown of Eldenmoor. I hadn't been back in 3 years, not since I'd taken the journalism job in the city, but my grandmother's letter had left me no choice. Her usually steady handwriting had been shaky, desperate, the words almost illegible in places. "Please come home, Oliver," she'd written. "Something is happening in Eldenmoor, something I should have told you about years ago." The old wooden bridge that served as the only entrance to our village came into view through the mist. It had stood there for over 200 years, its ancient planks groaning under the weight of my car as I crossed. The sound brought back memories of childhood, of running across those weathered boards with Helen Brackley, both of us laughing as we raced to the other side. But today, something felt different. The fog seemed to cling to the bridge's surface, writhing around the support beams like living tendrils. I noticed the military vehicles first. 3 large olive drab trucks parked near the village entrance, their presence as alien as spacecraft in our tiny community. A soldier stood at attention nearby, his uniform crisp and dark against the swirling mist. He watched my car pass with an unnaturally still gaze. The village itself appeared unchanged at first glance. The same stone cottages lined the narrow streets, their slate roofs glistening with morning dew. The old church spire still pierced the sky like a needle, its weathered clock face marking time as it had for generations. But there was something wrong in the air, a heaviness that pressed against my skin like a physical weight. I found my grandmother, Mildred, in her Victorian house at the edge of the village. The paint was peeling worse than I remembered, great sheets of it curling away from the wood like dead skin. She sat at her writing desk by the window, her silver hair illuminated by weak sunlight. When she turned to look at me, I barely recognized her face. Her eyes, usually bright with warmth, were wide with fear. "Ollie," she whispered, rising shakily from her chair. "You came. Thank God you came." She hurried to embrace me, her thin frame trembling. "They're here to remove it, just as I always feared they would." "Remove what, Gran?" I asked, helping her back to her seat. "What's going on? Why are there soldiers in the village?" She reached for a leather-bound journal on her desk, its pages stuffed with loose papers and photographs. "The bridge," she said, her voice barely audible. "They're here to take away the bridge, and when they do..." She stopped, her hands shaking as she opened the journal. "It's just an old bridge, Gran," I said gently, wondering if her mind was finally slipping. She was 78 after all. Maybe it needs to be replaced, that's all. She seized my wrist with surprising strength. "Listen to me, Oliver, that bridge is more than wood and nails. It's part of something ancient, something that's protected this village for centuries. I should have told you the truth years ago, but I thought if you didn't know you'd be safer." Before she could continue, a deep rumbling sound filled the air. We both turned to look out the window. A massive military convoy was rolling into the village, more vehicles than I'd ever seen in one place. At their head was a black SUV, its windows tinted, dark as pitch. "They're here," my grandmother whispered, clutching her journal to her chest. "God help us all, they're really here." The convoy came to a stop in the village square, and from the black SUV emerged a tall figure in a pristine military uniform. Even from a distance, there was something unsettling about the way he moved, too precise, too controlled. He surveyed the gathering crowd of villagers with cold efficiency. "That's Captain Darnell," my grandmother said, her voice thick with dread. "I knew they'd send him. They always send him when it's time." "Time for what?" I asked. But she just shook her head and began frantically flipping through her journal. "Take these," she said, thrusting a stack of yellowed papers into my hands. "Read them, understand? But not here, not where they might see." I glanced at the top page. It was dated 1843. The handwriting faded, but still legible. "The creature stirs beneath our feet. The bridge must hold. The bridge must always hold." Outside, Captain Darnell's voice carried across the square, unnaturally clear in the heavy air. "Residents of Eldenmoor," he announced. By order of the government, this village is now under temporary military jurisdiction. The bridge will be removed within 48 hours. All residents must prepare for potential evacuation. An uneasy murmur rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Pembroke, who ran the village shop, stepped forward. But why? That bridge has stood for generations. It's our only way in and out of the village. Captain Darnell's response was practiced, emotionless. The structure has been deemed unsafe. This is a matter of public safety. Cooperation is mandatory. I watched as the villagers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging worried glances. Something about their behavior seemed off, their movements too rigid, their faces too blank. Only Helen Brackley, standing near the back of the crowd in her nurse's uniform, showed any real emotion. Her eyes met mine through the fog, and I saw raw fear in them. My grandmother's hand found mine, her grip desperate. "The dreams will start tonight," she whispered. "They always do when it begins. Don't sleep, Oliver. Whatever you do, don't sleep." I looked down at the papers in my hand, then back at the imposing figure of Captain Darnell. He stood perfectly still, his gaze sweeping the crowd like a searchlight. And for just a moment, in the swirling fog, I could have sworn his eyes reflected the light like a cat's. The rumbling of military engines filled the air again as soldiers began to move toward the bridge. The ancient wood seemed to groan in protest, and somewhere in the distance, deep beneath the earth, something answered. I spent the afternoon in my grandmother's study, poring over the papers she'd given me. The yellowed pages told a story that seemed impossible, a history of Eldenmoor that went far beyond anything I'd learned growing up here. According to the documents, the village wasn't built here by chance. The first settlers had chosen this spot for a reason, establishing the community as a sort of guard post over something that slumbered in the depths below. The bridge featured prominently in every account. It wasn't just a means of crossing the ravine, it was part of an ancient binding, a seal that kept whatever lay beneath contained. The wood had been cut from trees that once grew in the deep forests surrounding the village, trees that no longer existed anywhere else in England. Each plank had been blessed by 7 different holy men, the wood soaked in sacred oils and marked with symbols that had faded with time. A knock at the door startled me from my reading. Helen stood on the porch, still in her nurse's uniform, her face pale with worry. "Ollie," she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "We need to talk." I invited her in, but she shook her head. "Not here. Meet me at the old church in an hour. There's something you need to see." Before I could question her, she hurried away, disappearing into the thickening fog that now blanketed the village. The sun was setting, though it was hard to tell through the heavy cloud cover. The air had grown colder, carrying a damp, earthy smell that reminded me of opened graves. I found my grandmother in the kitchen, brewing tea with trembling hands. "I have to meet Helen," I told her. "Will you be all right?" She nodded, not looking up. "Take this," she said, pressing a small leather pouch into my hand. "It's rowan berries and graveyard dirt. You might need it before the night's done." She finally met my eyes. "And Oliver, if you hear singing, cover your ears and run as fast as you can." The walk to the church was unsettling. The fog had grown so thick I could barely see 10 feet ahead, but that wasn't what bothered me most. It was the silence. Eldenmoor had always been quiet, but this was different. There were no birds, no distant barking dogs, not even the sound of the wind in the trees. The whole village felt like it was holding its breath. The church loomed out of the mist like a mountain, its ancient stones black with age. Helen was waiting by the side door, a ring of keys in her hand. "Quick," she whispered, ushering me inside. "They're watching the main entrance." The interior was dark, save for a few flickering candles near the altar. The air was heavy with incense and decay. Helen led me through the nave to a small door I'd never noticed before, hidden behind a tapestry. It opened onto a narrow stone staircase that spiraled down into darkness. 3 people came into the clinic today, Helen said as we descended, all with the same symptoms, nosebleeds, headaches, and all of them talking about the dreams. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs and turned to face me. "They're dreaming about what's under the village, Ollie, all of them, and they're all drawing the same thing." She pushed open another door, revealing what must have been an ancient crypt. The walls were lined with shelves carved into the stone, but it was what covered the floor that made my blood run cold. Dozens of drawings were scattered across the flagstones, all done in black ink or charcoal. Each one showed the same image, a vast, dark shape with countless limbs partially hidden behind what looked like a wooden lattice, the bridge. "Look at the dates," Helen said, pointing to the corners of the drawings. "These were all done today, by different people who never spoke to each other." I picked up one of the drawings, and as I did, a deep vibration ran through the floor. Dust rained down from the ceiling, and the candles flickered wildly. In the distance, I heard the sound of splintering wood. "They've started," Helen whispered. "They're taking down the bridge." The vibration grew stronger, and with it came a sound I'd never heard before. A low, rhythmic pulsing, like a massive heart beating far below our feet. The drawings on the floor began to move, sliding across the stone as if pulled by an invisible tide, all pointing toward the same spot in the center of the room. That's when we heard the singing. It wasn't like any music I'd ever heard before. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, a chorus of voices that made my teeth vibrate and my vision blur. The melody was ancient, wrong somehow, like a lullaby twisted inside out. Helen grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my flesh. "Don't listen," she hissed, pulling me toward the stairs. "Your grandmother must have told you. We can't listen to it." But the song was impossible to ignore. It wound its way through my mind like smoke, bringing with it images I couldn't have imagined on my own. I saw the village as it had been centuries ago, saw the first settlers constructing the bridge over a chasm that seemed to have no bottom, and beneath them, in the darkness, something watched, something waited. We stumbled up the stairs, our movements growing sluggish as the singing grew louder. The church above was no longer empty. Dark figures stood in the nave, swaying gently to the ethereal music. I recognized Mrs. Pembroke from the shop and old Mr. Harrison, who tended the cemetery. Their eyes were closed, faces peaceful, but black liquid trickled from their noses and ears. Helen pulled me behind a pillar just as Captain Darnell entered through the main doors. He walked with that same unnaturally precise movement, but now there was something else, something wrong about the way his shadows fell. They seemed to move independently of his body, stretching and twisting across the stone floor like living things. "The seal is weakening," he announced to the swaying villagers, his voice harmonizing perfectly with the otherworldly song. "The bridge's power fades. Soon, the sleeper will rise again." I fumbled in my pocket for the pouch my grandmother had given me. The rowan berries and graveyard dirt spilled into my palm, and the moment they touched my skin, the singing became slightly muffled, as if heard through water. My head began to clear. "Here," I whispered, pressing half the mixture into Helen's hand. She blinked rapidly as the influence of the song diminished. Through the church windows, we could see more villagers walking through the fog, all moving toward the bridge. Their steps were synchronized, creating a hollow drumbeat on the cobblestones. Above them, the sky had turned an impossible shade of purple-black, though it was barely sunset. "We need to get to the village records," Helen whispered. "The real ones. They're kept in Reverend Moore's study." "How do you know about those?" I asked. "Because I've been watching," she replied. "Ever since people started getting sick 3 months ago." The symptoms were strange. Shared dreams, nosebleeds, speaking in languages they'd never learned. The Reverend was the only one who wasn't surprised. He's been expecting this. We made our way along the wall, keeping to the shadows. The villagers paid us no attention, lost in their trance, but Captain Darnell was another matter. His head turned slightly as we passed, though his eyes remained fixed forward. One of his shadows writhed toward us, and for a moment I saw something in its depths, rows upon rows of eyes, opening and closing in perfect rhythm with the song. The Reverend's study was locked, but Helen produced another key. Inside, the small room was a maze of books and papers. Ancient texts filled the shelves, their spines bound in materials I didn't want to identify, but it was the map on the wall that drew our attention. It showed Eldenmoor from above, but not as it existed today. This was older, much older, and drawn in faded brown ink that I realized with a shock was probably blood. The village formed a perfect circle, with the bridge at its northernmost point. But beneath the streets was another pattern, a vast network of tunnels and chambers that spread out like a web. And at the center, in a chamber larger than the village itself, something had been drawn. The ink was too faded to make out the details, but the longer I stared at it, the more my eyes hurt. The bridge was never just a bridge, a voice said behind us. We spun to find Reverend Moore standing in the doorway. The elderly priest looked exhausted, his face gray and lined with worry. It was the last link in the chain, the final key in the lock, and now they're breaking it. Another tremor shook the building, stronger than before. Through the study's window, we could see the military vehicles moving into position around the bridge. Soldiers were stringing up powerful lights, pushing back the darkness that seemed to be gathering around them. But the lights didn't penetrate the fog that now enveloped the bridge itself, fog that moved and shifted like something alive. "What's really down there?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The Reverend moved to his desk and opened a drawer. He withdrew a small wooden box, its surface covered in carvings similar to the faded marks I'd seen on the bridge's supports. "Something old," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "Something that was here long before us, sleeping beneath the earth. The first settlers didn't build the village to contain it. They built it to worship it. But then something happened, something that made them realize their mistake. That's when they built the bridge." He opened the box, revealing a collection of small, round stones, each one marked with a different symbol. They seemed to absorb the light around them. "Your grandmother isn't the only one who's been keeping secrets, Oliver. Some of us have been preparing for this day our entire lives." From outside came the sound of splintering wood, followed by the deep groan of ancient timbers giving way. The floor shuddered beneath our feet, and the stones in the box began to vibrate, clicking against each other like chattering teeth. "They're removing the support beams," Reverend Moore said, closing the box quickly. "We don't have much time." He moved to the bookshelf and pulled out a thick volume bound in cracked leather. The bridge wasn't just built to contain what's below, it was built to channel its power. Every traveler who crossed it, every cart and car that passed over those boards, they all added to the binding, strengthening it with their momentum, their life force. "That's why they're not just destroying it," Helen said, realization dawning on her face. "They're removing it piece by piece. They're unraveling the energy." The Reverend nodded grimly. "Captain Darnell and his men, they're not really military. They're members of an ancient order, one that's existed in secret since the first settlements. But where we work to keep the sleeper bound, they seek to wake it." Another tremor rocked the building, stronger than before. Books tumbled from the shelves, and somewhere in the village, glass shattered. The singing had grown louder, and now other sounds joined it, a deep thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself, and beneath that, something that might have been laughter. I moved to the window. The fog had grown thicker, but through it I could see the villagers gathered around the bridge. They stood perfectly still, heads tilted back, black liquid now flowing freely from their eyes and mouths. The soldiers worked among them, their movements mechanical and precise as they dismantled the ancient structure. Captain Darnell stood at the bridge's center, his arms raised, conducting the horrible chorus like a maestro. "My grandmother's journal," I said, turning back to the Reverend. "It mentioned something about a ritual, a way to strengthen the binding. Could we?" He cut me off with a sharp gesture. "Look at the ground." I did. Fine black powder was seeping up through the floorboards, forming intricate patterns that shifted and changed even as I watched. The same powder was visible through the window, spreading through the streets like ink through water. "It's already starting," the Reverend whispered. "The sleeper is rising, reaching out through the earth itself. Soon, the whole village will be consumed." Helen grabbed the book from his hands, flipping through the pages frantically. "There has to be something we can do, some way to stop this." "There might be," Reverend Moore said, picking up the box of stones again. "But we'll need help. Your grandmother, Oliver, she's one of the last living descendants of the original settlers, and her blood." He paused, looking at me intently. "Your blood carries power." A scream cut through the singing, high, desperate, and terrifyingly human. Through the window, I saw one of the villagers collapse, their body convulsing. The black liquid pouring from them began to move with purpose, flowing toward the bridge like a stream of living darkness. Where it touched, the ground began to bubble and smoke. "We have to hurry," the Reverend said, already moving toward the door. "The old church crypt. There's an entrance there, a way down to the deeper chambers. If we can reach the central chamber before they finish removing the bridge." His voice trailed off as the lights in the village suddenly went out, plunging everything into darkness. In the distance, I could see the military's floodlights sputtering and dying, one by one. The only illumination came from the strange purple-black sky and from something else, a pale, pulsing glow that seemed to emanate from the earth itself. "It's calling them," Helen whispered, pointing to the window. The villagers had begun to move again, but differently now. They crawled on all fours, their movements jerky and inhuman, heading toward the darkest patches of ground where the black powder had gathered thickest. The Reverend thrust the box of stones into my hands. "Your grandmother will know what to do with these. Go to her, quickly. We'll meet at the crypt entrance in 20 minutes. "What are you going to do?" I asked. He smiled grimly, pulling an old iron key from around his neck. "I'm going to wake up some old friends. The dead of Eldenmoor have guarded this secret for centuries. Perhaps they'll guard it one more night." The smile faded from his face as another, deeper tremor shook the building. This one didn't stop, building in intensity until the very air seemed to vibrate. And from somewhere far below, I heard something vast beginning to stir. I ran through the darkened village streets, clutching the box of stones to my chest. The fog had become almost solid, seeming to push against me with physical force. Through it, I caught glimpses of villagers, or what had once been villagers. They moved through the darkness like broken puppets, their joints bending in impossible ways. The black liquid that poured from them left trails on the cobblestones, trails that slowly began to move on their own. My grandmother's house was dark when I arrived, but I could see candlelight flickering in the study window. I found her there, surrounded by open books and scattered papers, writing frantically in her journal. She looked up as I entered, her eyes wild. "The stones," she said, reaching for the box before I could speak. Moore finally understood. "Good." Her hands trembled as she opened it, picking up one of the small black rocks. "These were carved from the same earth that holds the sleeper. They can channel its power, direct it. That's what the first settlers used to bind it." "But what is it?" I demanded. "What's really down there?" She met my eyes, and for a moment I saw the weight of generations in her gaze. "Something that doesn't belong in our world. Something that fell from the spaces between the stars long before humans walked the earth. The first settlers found it sleeping and thought it was a god." She picked up another stone, rolling it between her fingers. They were wrong. The continuous tremor suddenly spiked, making the house groan around us. Through the window, I saw the purple-black sky pulse with sickly light. The sound that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard. A vast, wet tearing, as if reality itself was being pulled apart. "The bridge," my grandmother whispered. "They've reached the foundation stones." She stood quickly, gathering the stones back into their box. "We need to go, now. The crypt." A new sound cut through the night. Church bells, ringing out in a chaotic rhythm, but there was something else beneath the bronze tones, something that made my skin crawl. Voices. The bells were screaming. "Moore has wakened them," my grandmother said, a grim smile on her face. "The old guard rises." We hurried outside. The fog had thinned enough to see the graveyard beside the church. The ground there was heaving, earth churning as figures pulled themselves up from their graves. But these weren't the shambling corpses of horror films. These shapes moved with purpose, their ancient bones glowing with the same pale light that pulsed beneath the earth. The crawling villagers turned toward the cemetery, their black-stained faces twisting in rage. As we watched, the two groups met in a clash of bone and flesh. The undead defenders formed a line, pushing back against the corrupted living with surprising strength. "The door to the crypt will be clear now," my grandmother said, pulling me toward the church. "The dead remember their oaths." We found Helen waiting by the crypt entrance, her nurse's uniform stained with something dark that moved when I looked directly at it. "Moore?" I asked. She shook her head. "Still in the cemetery. He's directing them, keeping them focused." She held up an ancient-looking tome. "But he gave me this, said we'd need it below." The three of us descended into the crypt, the sounds of combat fading behind us. The narrow staircase led deeper than I remembered from my earlier visit with Helen. The air grew colder with each step and the walls began to change. The dressed stone of the crypt gave way to older rock, then to something that looked almost organic, its surface rippling faintly in our candlelight. The original chamber is ahead, my grandmother said, her voice barely a whisper, where they first found it, where they built the first bindings before the bridge. The stairs ended at a vast door that seemed to be made of solid bronze, its surface covered in symbols that hurt my eyes to look at. But the door hung open, its heavy frame twisted as if something immensely strong had torn through it. Beyond lay darkness, but not emptiness. Something moved in that blackness, something huge. And as we stood there, a voice spoke, not in our ears, but directly into our minds. It was ancient, vast, and carried the cold of interstellar spaces in its words. "The seal breaks," it said. "I wake, and I remember what your kind did to me." The candlelight caught something moving in the darkness, a vast shape like a mountain of flesh slowly unfurling, and then we saw the eyes. Thousands upon thousands of eyes, opening all at once, each one filled with the same purple-black light that stained the sky above. My grandmother moved with surprising speed, pulling the stones from their box and arranging them in a pattern on the chamber floor. They began to glow with a pale blue light, forming a barrier between us and the writhing darkness beyond. "The stones will hold it back," she said, her voice strained. "But not for long, not without the bridge's power to anchor them." Helen opened the ancient book Reverend Moore had given her, its pages crackling with age. "There's a ritual here," she said, fingers tracing lines of text that seemed to move on their own. "A way to create a new binding, but it requires..." She stopped, looking up at me with horror. "Blood of the original bloodline," my grandmother finished. "Your blood, Oliver, the same blood that flows in my veins, passed down from the first settlers." She gripped my hand. "But there's something else, something more didn't know. The ritual needs both sides of the binding, those who would seal and those who would wake." A slow clapping sound echoed through the chamber. Captain Darnell stepped from the shadows, but he was no longer trying to maintain his human appearance. His skin rippled like oil on water, and his eyes were pools of swirling darkness. "Very good, Mrs. Ramsey," he said, his voice resonating with unnatural harmonics. "You always did understand more than the others." He gestured, and more figures emerged from the darkness. His soldiers, their forms now twisted and elongated, moving with that same terrible precision. "You're like it," I said, understanding finally dawning. "You're not human, you never were." "We are its children," Darnell replied. "Born from the dreams it sent forth while it slept. For centuries we've waited, infiltrating your military, your government, preparing for this moment." He spread his arms wide. "Our parent stirs, the bridge falls, and this village will become a gate, opening the way for others like us." The thing in the darkness shifted again, and I felt its attention focus on us like a physical weight. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and decay. "Why the show?" Helen demanded, her hands gripping the book tightly. "Why pretend to be military? Why not just destroy the bridge?" "The ritual goes both ways," my grandmother answered before Darnell could speak. "Power needs purpose. Action needs belief. They needed the villagers to accept them, to give their presence meaning, just like the first binding needed the settlers' faith to work." "Smart old woman," Darnell purred. "Too smart. That's why we couldn't let you warn anyone. That's why we clouded their minds, filled them with our song. But you..." His face twisted in frustration. "You and your grandson, the nurse, the priest, you all resisted. Something in your blood fights our influence." Another tremor shook the chamber, stronger than before. Above us, I heard the final supports of the bridge giving way. The barrier of glowing stones flickered. "It's time," Darnell said. His skin was melting away completely now, revealing something dark and angular beneath. "The old binding dies. A new age begins." But my grandmother was smiling. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something that made Darnell hiss, a piece of wood, weathered and gray with age. "From the original bridge," she said. "Blessed by 7 holy men, soaked in sacred oils. I've kept it all these years, waiting." She pressed it into my hand. "The ritual needs both sides," you said. "Both sides." I felt power surge through the wood into my body. The symbols carved into its surface began to glow with the same blue light as the stones. Helen started reading from the book, her voice taking on strange harmonics that made the air ripple. The thing in the darkness roared, a sound that contained universes of cold and emptiness. Its children surged forward, their forms twisting impossibly as they abandoned all pretense of humanity. But my grandmother raised her hands and the barrier of stones flared brighter. Both sides of the binding, she repeated. Those who would wake and those who would seal. We are the sealers, the guardians, the keepers of the gate. And you, she looked at Darnell with fierce triumph. You just admitted what you are. You gave your nature meaning. Power needs purpose. Understanding and fear flashed across Darnell's inhuman features. No. The ritual requires both, my grandmother said. And now we have both. The blood of the sealers. She grabbed my hand, the one holding the bridge fragment, and the essence of the awakeners. She began to chant in a language that made my ears bleed. Helen's voice joined hers, reading from the book. The stones pulsed brighter and brighter, and I felt power surging through the piece of bridge wood, up my arm, into my chest. The chamber erupted in chaos. Darnell and his soldiers tried to reach us, their bodies contorting into impossible shapes, but they couldn't cross the barrier of stones. The massive presence in the darkness thrashed and roared, its countless eyes flashing with purple fire. The very air seemed to tear apart around us, reality fraying at its edges. The blood, my grandmother gasped between words of the chant. Now, Oliver, I understood what I had to do. I gripped the bridge fragment tight, letting its rough edges cut into my palm. Blood, my blood, carrying centuries of the sealer's legacy, dripped onto the stones. Each drop ignited like blue fire, and the barrier began to expand. Darnell screamed, but it wasn't a human sound. His true form was fully visible now, a writhing mass of angles and shadows that hurt to look at. His soldiers melted into similar shapes, their unified shriek piercing my skull like needles. You can't. Darnell's voice echoed from a dozen mouths. The bridge is gone, there's nothing to anchor the binding. Helen's voice rose above the chaos as she turned to the final page of the book. The text there glowed with its own light, and as she read, I felt something shift in the chamber's energy. The power flowing through me changed, becoming more focused, more directed. The bridge was never the anchor, my grandmother said, her voice carrying despite its weakness. It was only ever a channel, a focus for what was already here. She pressed her free hand to the chamber floor. The true anchor is the earth itself, the ground that holds it, the land that it tried to corrupt. As if in response to her words, pale blue light began seeping up through cracks in the floor, the same light we'd seen emanating from the bones of the graveyard defenders above. The light of the land itself, fighting back against the corruption. The thing in the darkness spoke again, its voice shaking dust from the ceiling. You cannot bind me again. I am awakened. I am free. No, my grandmother said, you're not. Because you forgot something important. She looked at Darnell and his twisted soldiers. Your children, your awakeners. They've been adding their power to this place too. Every time they walked these streets in human form, every time they played at being mortal, they anchored themselves to this place just as we did. The chamber filled with screaming as Darnell and his soldiers realized the truth. Their connection to this place, built up over years of infiltration, was being turned against them. The barrier wasn't just holding them back, it was drawing power from them, using their essence just as it used our blood. The piece of bridge wood in my hand burst into blue flame that didn't burn. Helen's voice reached a crescendo, the words of the ritual hammering against reality itself. My grandmother's grip on my hand tightened as she spoke the final words of her chant. Everything happened at once. The barrier of stones exploded outward, becoming a wall of solid light that rushed toward the darkness. The thing with countless eyes reared up, its true form finally visible. A mass of flesh and angles and mouths and eyes that went on forever, that couldn't exist in our reality without breaking it. It tried to retreat, to pull back into the depths from which it had nearly escaped, but it was too late. The light struck it like a physical force. At the same time, Darnell and his soldiers were pulled screaming into the barrier, their bodies dissolving into pure energy that fed the binding. The chamber filled with blue fire that flowed like water, covering everything, seeping into every crack and crevice. The seal, Helen shouted over the roaring chaos. It's working. The thing in the darkness thrashed and fought, but each movement only entangled it further in the web of light. I felt its rage, its hatred, its absolute alienness as it realized it was being bound once again. But this time, the binding was different. This time, it wasn't just being put back to sleep. A prison of its own making, my grandmother whispered, her voice fading, built from the power of both sides. Perfect balance, perfect binding. The light reached its peak so bright it erased the world. The last thing I saw was the thing's countless eyes closing, one by one, as it was drawn back into the earth. The last thing I heard was my grandmother's final words. The bridge was never just a bridge. It was a lesson, a reminder. Everything has two sides. Every binding needs both the sealer and the sealed. Remember that, Oliver, remember. Then the light took everything, and darkness followed. I woke in the village hospital 3 days later. Helen was there, looking exhausted but alive. She told me what happened after the binding. The villagers had been found scattered throughout Eldenmoor, unconscious but alive, with no memory of what had occurred. The military vehicles were discovered abandoned, their interiors empty, as if their occupants had simply vanished. Your grandmother, Helen said softly, taking my hand. She used too much of her own energy in the binding. The doctors say it was a heart attack, but we know better. She squeezed my fingers. She saved us all. When I was strong enough to walk, Helen took me to the village edge where the bridge had stood. The ravine remained, but something had changed. The earth had shifted, folding in on itself, creating natural stone formations that formed a new path across the gap. It looked as if it had been there for centuries. The land remembers, a voice said behind us. Reverend Moore approached, leaning heavily on a cane. He had survived the battle in the cemetery, though the effort of controlling the ancient defenders had left its mark on him. It knows what happened here, what's buried here. The villagers, I asked, will they ever remember? He shook his head. Better that they don't, but they'll feel it in their bones and blood. This place is different now, safer in some ways, more dangerous in others. He was right. In the months that followed, Eldenmoor changed. The fog remained, but it was natural now, no longer carrying that strange, living quality. The villagers went about their lives, rebuilding what had been damaged. But there was a new awareness in them. They might not remember what happened, but some part of them knew. They treated the land with more respect, kept to the old ways without knowing why. I found my grandmother's journal among her belongings, along with a letter addressed to me. The final pages contained her last writings, completed just before the army arrived. The truth about Eldenmoor isn't in its bridges or its bindings, but in its balance, light and dark, sealing and sealed. The village exists in the space between, and that's where it must stay. I've taught you what you need to know, shown you what you need to see. The responsibility passes to you now, my dear Oliver. Watch, wait, protect. I stayed in Eldenmoor after that. How could I not? The village needed a guardian, someone who remembered the truth. Helen stayed too, and together we learned more about the old ways, about keeping the balance. The stone formations that replaced the bridge became a natural monument, drawing tourists and historians who sensed there was something special about them, but could never quite figure out what. Sometimes, on very quiet nights, I walk to the edge of the ravine and look down into the darkness below. The thing that sleeps there is bound more securely than ever, wrapped in a prison of its own children's power, sealed by the blood of those who would keep it contained. But it's not gone. It will never be gone. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I hear singing, not the terrible, mind-bending chorus of before, but something older, deeper, the sound of the earth itself, reminding us of what lies beneath, reminding us to keep watch, to remember. The bridge that connected Eldenmoor to the outside world is gone, but other connections remain, bonds of blood and memory, of duty and sacrifice. My grandmother understood that. She knew that true power isn't in the strength of our barriers, but in the balance we maintain between what must be contained and those who would contain it. I write this account now so others might understand if the time comes again. The army removed our bridge, but they gave us something far more valuable in return. The truth about our village, our purpose, our place in the eternal dance between sleeping and waking, binding and bound. The fog is rolling in again, night is falling, and somewhere deep below Eldenmoor, countless eyes remain closed in an endless sleep, dreaming dreams that must never wake. Keep watching, keep waiting. Remember,